Hello and welcome. My name is Josh Cass and I am delighted to be able to welcome you to this seminar on Eastern Orthodoxy and Sexual Diversity, a project of the British Council US's Bridging Voices programme. The Eastern Orthodoxy and Sexual Diversity project is conducted by principal investigators from the University of Exeter and Fordham University, supported by the Henry Luce Foundation and British Council US. And today we'll be hearing from Dr. Brandon Gallagher, Dr. Aristotle Papanicolaou, and Gregory Tucker. Dr. Gallagher is Senior Lecturer of Systematic and Comparative Theology at University of Exeter, where he is also the Orthodox Associate Chaplain in the university's Multi-Faith Chaplaincy and an Eastern Orthodox Deacon. He is also the current co-chair of the Eastern Orthodox Studies Unit at the American Academy of Religion. And since 2020, he has been engaged in interreligious dialogue and is currently co-editing a volume for Brill on orthodoxy and world religions. Aristotle Papanicolaou is a professor of theology and the Archbishop Demetrios Chair in Orthodox Theology and Culture. He is co-director of the Orthodox Christian Studies Centre at Fordham University, where he initiated a Henry Luce funded project on Orthodox Christianity and human rights, and is a senior fellow at the Emory University Centre for the Study of Law and Religion. Gregory Tucker is a research assistant at the Chair for Liturgical Studies in the Faculty of Theology at the University of Regensburg, Germany, where he is completing his doctoral dissertation on medieval Greek hymns. He studied previously at the University of Oxford, St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary in New York, and Fordham University in New York. We're also fortunate to have with us Dr. Sarah Riccardi-Swartz and Michael Hall, who, as observers to this project and working in adjacent fields, will be sharing their reflections on the need for projects such as this. And just a word on their biographies. Dr. Riccardi-Swartz is a postdoctoral fellow at Arizona State University, where she works on American religion and politics. In 1819, she was a Louisville Institute Fellow in the study of North American Christianity, and in 2019-20, she held both the Charlotte W. Newcomb Fellowship and the National Endowment for the Humanities Orthodox Christian Studies Dissertation Fellowship. She's a trained documentary filmmaker and is committed to interdisciplinary research and methodologies that are collaborative and public-facing. Michael Hall is a program officer with the Open Society Eurasia program. Michael holds an MA in Regional Studies for Russia, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia from Harvard University. He has studied in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, and previously worked for the International Crisis Group in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, and the Aga Khan Humanities Project in Tajikistan. Excuse me. Just to note, this is a public panel event and is being recorded. And following presentations by Gregory and Brandon, we will open up for a Q&A. And I'd invite you to please use the chat function to submit questions as they arise, and we will aspire to answer as many of them as possible during the question and answer session. After this event, you will be receiving an email from the principal investigators, which will include their final report and other materials, including an evaluation questionnaire, which, on behalf of all those involved, I would encourage you to engage with. And we'll shortly be hearing from Gregory and Brandon about their project, and in doing so, they will be focusing very much on the future of this project and how we, as interested audiences, can engage with that process. And in doing so, it's worth reflecting on the challenges and opportunities presented by a research project such as this. And I really would draw your attention to their final report, which is an excellent read and begins to sketch out a path ahead. And at this point, I'd invite Michael and first Sarah to share some brief reflections on the need for a conversation of this nature. So Sarah, thank you.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you to the Bridging Voices project. The Eastern Orthodox Church is one of the largest Christian bodies in the world with over 200 million members. Many of these members live in countries that have political leaders and policies that seek to deny LGBTQ+ communities basic human rights. And often, Orthodox churches in those countries are supportive of these types of policies. Why might that be the case? The Exeter-Fordham Bridging Voices project draws attention to how theology shapes not only the cultures of religious institutions, but their engagement with the civic sphere. Certainly, there are a plurality of social opinions among Orthodox Christians themselves regarding sexual diversity, but institutionally, the Church exhibits signs of opposition, particularly to extension of legal protections to LGBTQ+ persons. In order to understand this opposition, we have to both make sense of how the Orthodox Church understands the body, sex, gender, and sexuality, and to be aware of how these teachings and practices are related to social and political frameworks. This project is one of the first studies that makes Orthodox theology socially legible in ways that help us understand the broader cultural ramifications of Orthodox Christianity's institutional stances on sexual diversity. This project is important not only for thinking through the ways in which we can better dialogue with Orthodox Church leaders and laity about sexual diversity and human rights issues, it also draws out the intersectional political issues that are part of broader conversations in global Christianity today. The socially conservative attitudes of many, if not all, Orthodox Christian communities regarding sexual diversity is not just part of the traditional ethos of the Church. This is a political stance that intersects with other issues, including anti-Westernism, anti-democracy, ableism, gender gaps, and racism, just to name a few. This project asks those of us outside of Orthodox theology and those of us in civil society to realize both the challenges and the very real potential that dialoguing and working with the Orthodox Church on the topic of sexual diversity might actually have for the LGBT community. I'm going to pass it over to you now, Michael.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you, Josh, and to all involved in this project for this opportunity. It really is a great privilege and an honor to be part of this conversation. As Josh mentioned, I do work for the Open Society Foundations, and this is a global philanthropic network that supports initiatives around the world that are aimed at advancing the cause of human rights, equality, social justice, and so on, and with a particular focus on the rights of marginalized groups of various kinds, whether that be by virtue of ability, gender, or sexual orientation, or other aspects of their identity and indeed selfhood. And as Sarah has rightly pointed out, we are at a time now when we have seen a great increase, an increased level of threat, I would say, to many of these issues, to many of these rights, with the rise globally of populism, xenophobia, and so on. And I think in a context such as this, for an organization such as mine, the one that I work for, this kind of project becomes extremely important. And I would see its importance lying really across two parameters. The first is the link between academia and policy. And this is something that we have a particular focus on, or have had a particular focus on within the Eurasia program, of trying to promote research, socially engaged research that seeks to itself advance critical thinking and also to promote the very ideals that we as a foundation represent. And I think a project such as this, which seeks to bridge, as the name quite eloquently states, these communities, to bridge the academic and indeed in this case the theological community and connect them to broader public discourse and indeed policy, is something that is extremely important at this time in particular. Secondly, and perhaps most germanely perhaps to this conversation, I think is the very nature of the dialogue that is taking place here. As Sarah has mentioned, we have seen a great deal of pressure coming from conservative circles of various kinds towards many of the groups that we as a foundation are seeking to assist and support. And I think this has led to a certain, in some cases, a kind of defensive mentality on the parts of organizations such as ours and indeed others that has blinded us, I think, to what opportunities there might be there actually to find engagement, even on these very sensitive and very challenging topics, which may seem a priori as being somehow insurmountable. But I think what this project demonstrates is that there is room, there is a space for respectful dialogue. And I think this is something that we, as donors in general, need to be much more cognizant of in our work, that we need to also try to find these opportunities where they might be. So I am, again, it is an enormous honor and privilege for me to be part of this conversation, and again, greatly looking forward to it.
Thank you, Michael. It now gives me great pleasure to hand over to Brandon Gallagher and first to Gregory Tucker.
Thank you very much, Josh. So this project has been running now for 3 years since it was selected for sponsorship as part of the second iteration of the British Council's Bridging Voices scheme. There's often been some confusion over the title of our project, which is often referred to incorrectly simply as Bridging Voices, but we actually chose the snappy and memorable title, Contemporary Eastern Orthodox Identity and the Challenges of Pluralism and Sexual Diversity in a Secular Age. There will be a test on that at the end. With respect to the so-called Eastern Orthodox Christian tradition, our project has investigated attitudes towards LGBTQ+ persons, frameworks for the conceptualization and expression of sexual identity, issues around the accommodation of diversity and dissent from official teachings within church communities and societies with majority Orthodox populations, approaches to legal provisions for the protection of LGBTQ+ rights, an acknowledgement of relationships through marriage and civil partnership. Questions of sexual diversity are some of the most challenging for the Orthodox Church today and are frequently the subject of polarized debate. In many ways, they are iconic of bigger challenges, specifically of how Orthodoxy will come to develop its relationship with late modern secular and pluralistic democracy. Two distinct but inseparable goals guided the development of our project. The first was the clarification, articulation, and discussion of the theology and discipline of the Orthodox Church with regards to matters of sex, gender, and sexuality. The second was the contextualization and exploration of this teaching and practice in relation to secular pluralistic political frameworks. The first goal was set because although the stance of the Orthodox Church is frequently asserted with confidence and supported by the claim that it has been taught univocally from the beginning, there are in fact significant historical and theological questions to be answered. One reason for this is that many topics in theological anthropology have not been definitively addressed by the Orthodox Church, which in any case has not developed official theological positions on any number of topics in the way that other churches have. Another reason is that issues of sexual activity have generally been handled in a circumstantial way, with local variation in practice, and without comprehensive documentation or theological reflection. And a third reason is that much of the framework and vocabulary that is used in contemporary secular discourse on gender and sexuality has only developed in recent decades, and the sources of the Orthodox tradition cannot be used responsibly to respond to it without a considerable effort at conceptual translation. Therefore, the Orthodox Church must urgently undertake a searching and truthful investigation of its own complex, sometimes contradictory tradition. This project made but a small step at the very beginning of that journey. The second goal was set because the greatest tension over issues of sexuality and gender seems to emerge in contexts in which a pluralistic political framework establishes rights and privileges for LGBTQ+ persons, contrary to the disciplines of the Orthodox Church. Where Orthodox Christianity is a minority tradition, opposition to the protection of the rights of LGBTQ+ persons often takes the form of vociferous protest and enthusiastic embrace of religious exceptions clauses in legislation. Where Orthodox Christianity is a majority tradition with significant political influence, the Church often acts to block all such efforts altogether. The difference between these two contexts perhaps goes some way to explaining why Orthodox in the so-called diaspora are often keen to pursue theological debate on these questions, whereas those in the Orthodox old countries have tended to focus on concrete civic actions, since the lives of LGBTQ+ persons there are considerably circumscribed, if not immediately endangered. Another urgent task is therefore the exploration of how the Orthodox Church can and should act with respect to questions of human rights, and how the concerns of Orthodox Christians can be expressed in such a way that they can be meaningfully heard by secular actors and not simply bracketed as inscrutable and baseless religious opinion that need only be tolerated through exceptions to legislation. This has implication for actors in multiple arenas. Much of our project was directed towards enabling searching, honest, and respectful conversations along these lines. We held 2 digital workshops with approximately 20 participants each. The first digital workshop attempted to isolate the issues of disagreement and possible resources for response within the Church's own tradition and in other disciplines such as psychology. This workshop was absolutely fundamental to the planning of our major residential conference, which took place in Oxford in August 2019, and I'll return to this in a moment. Last autumn, Fordham University hosted an event which included a public lecture by Brandon Gallagher, followed by a panel discussion. This was our first attempt to take the conversation outside the controlled environment of our carefully planned workshops. The second digital workshop followed, at which we drew other voices into our conversation on the topic of what governments and other secular organisations might need to know. We've also produced a number of written reports and some video documentaries, and we'll share information about those in the email following this webinar. But our main activity and principal achievement was the planning and execution of an intensive weekend workshop in Oxford with some 50 participants drawn from across the Orthodox world. Considerable energy was expended on securing participants, lay and ordained, academics and non-academics, from a range of disciplines and professions, and a variety of Orthodox churches, who represent the full spectrum of opinion on issues of sexual diversity within the Orthodox Church. We were also very pleased and honoured to work with a number of partners from other Christian traditions. Securing a diverse group of Orthodox participants presented the principal challenge to the success of the project. The explosive nature of this discourse in public contexts, pressure from peers and ecclesiastical leaders, and the project's commitment to a balanced exchange sadly deterred some from accepting our invitation. Their decision reflects one of the biggest challenges for Orthodoxy today, which is the imminent threat to the disintegration of its culture of generous theological discourse into a series of siloed monologues. So-called conservatives frequently entertain no real questions about the validity of the positions considered traditional, repeat arguments and evidence that has been questioned in the course of sustained analysis for several decades without acknowledging the extent of the challenges, and do not dialogue with LGBTQ+ persons or their allies directly. On the other hand, so-called liberals often employ polarizing rhetoric that enshrines an us versus them mentality, assume bigotry, ignorance, and bad faith in interlocutors, and flagrantly dismiss the pillars of the tradition, such as the Bible and the writings of the Church Fathers. Moreover, censorship is increasing around this and other issues. Ecclesiastical academies are retreating from challenging intellectual engagement. A hard line on questions of sexual diversity is being employed as a litmus test of orthodoxy, and rhetoric from official ecclesiastical channels is frequently simplistic, repeating debunked or highly questionable arguments and evidence, and seeking to foreclose the conversation. All of this reflects not the mere reaffirmation of a pre-existing monolithic tradition on questions of sexual diversity, but the active construction of a monolithic tradition, and a concerted effort to silence those who would point to evidence that may lead in other directions in response to fundamental changes in Western society. In this context, it was no small achievement that a meeting such as ours could even take place. But in fact, the Oxford Conference exceeded our expectations. It demonstrated decisively that thoughtful and far-reaching discourse is possible on very complex topics within polarized groups, when a framework is established that promotes respect and equality of participation, and when the outcome of discussions is not predetermined. The open-ended nature of our dialogue enabled an exchange that was transparent and at times raw. For some, it is clear that the status quo of Orthodox approaches to questions of sexual diversity constitutes an essential part of the core of the Orthodox tradition. Maintenance of the received disciplines is thus an issue of Orthodox first principles. There can be no debate about their validity, and it remains only to find evidence for them and perhaps arguments to support them. On the other hand, it is clear for a few, and it must be stressed that this cannot be construed as the dominant, let alone sole view that was expressed at our conference. The disciplines of the Orthodox Church are plainly wrong and have no internal justification and must be corrected. The majority of participants, however, fell somewhere between these two poles. Many were moved by compassion in the face of suffering to argue that the Orthodox Church must at least extend generous pastoral care and condemn violence against LGBTQ+ persons, something which the Church has almost universally failed to do until now. Many question specific issues or acknowledge problems with certain lines of argument and evidence or the lack thereof, without coming to a firm conclusion about what the consequences must be. Since the conference, some have regrettably distanced themselves from it, but most remain convinced of the value of the process. For some of them, it was a watershed moment, which holds out the possibility of renewed, respectful dialogue. What was most clear was that this conversation needs to go on. It has only just begun, quietly and behind closed doors. Many in the Orthodox Church remain ignorant both of the complexity of their own tradition and the sophisticated analysis that undergirds contemporary discourse. Much learning, listening, and humility is required in the future.
Thank you, Gregory. Lots of interesting things there, including this question about the challenges of bringing together highly diverse groups. To give us a flavour, to give us all a flavour of the conference, there now follows a short film.
What is unique and distinctive about this particular meeting is, first of all, its size. There has, to the best of my knowledge, never been a meeting to do with sexual diversity of this number of people, of this wide number of different people backgrounds that they come from, both cultural, but also we have people who are not Orthodox, who are observers from the Anglican and the Catholic traditions. And we have people who are of a wide variety of opinions.
What's distinctive about this meeting is actually, on one level, simply the number of people we brought together. We've got some, I think, 40 or 50 people all together, all respecting each other, all prepared to have an open, frank discussion, happy to disagree with each other and not taking it personally. To be able to have a discussion like that is really remarkably rare and a treasure.
So there have been other meetings that have started addressing the issues of sexual minorities and gender identity within Orthodox Christianity. And for the most part, they have not resolved or come to any conclusive resolution for these issues or even what the issues are. And so I think it's very much an ongoing conversation, and the more voices we can include, ecumenical partners we can consult, different perspectives we can listen to and understand, will really help us develop a perspective that is accurate theologically, responds in a way that shows we've actually listened to and encountered human perspectives around us for the people with whom these issues really touch their lives, which is increasingly everyone.
Well, what I found unique about this particular meeting is the variety of people who are engaged. We have everyone from conservative clerics to secular philosophers to activists in the LGBT movement. And I think it's a wonderful conversation to get such different groups together and let them listen to one another. And I'm learning a lot so far, and I hope to learn more.
I believe that the biggest value we can gain is actually just dialogue. Right now, I don't think we're likely to see the Orthodox Church make big pronouncements, big changes in its approach. In fact, I would say the Orthodox Church doesn't make many pronouncements anyway. But bringing people together to discuss all sides of an issue, that dialogue needs to begin and needs to be continued over and over again. So this, I think, is a really great start to that sort of dialogue.
While there have been differences of opinions, there have been moments of intense conversation, but respectful conversation. I also noticed that there were people talking at lunch and going to liturgy together and really trying hard to relate to one another in ways that I guess as Christians we're called to relate. And that's very, very promising, because that shows that beyond simply the internet and conversations that happen there that can be very demonizing, you know, when you meet people face to face, I mean, real listening can occur and real challenge can occur. And I think that's been, it's been unique, I think, but I don't think necessarily surprising.
Thank you, Gregory. That was a really interesting film, and as you can see, a thoroughly diverse group. I'm now really happy to hand over to Dr. Gallagher.
Thank you so much, Josh, Gregory, and thank you for all for attending. What I want to talk about very briefly now is the path ahead, the road ahead. So to ask a question, what can civil society actors learn from this project about how to work with Orthodox communities on issues of sexual diversity and gender? And by civil society actors here, I'm using this in a very broad sense to include politicians, but also civil servants, academics who will be taken into this process of thinking through issues in the public sphere. So the first thing that they can do is education. Educate yourselves and others. So this project has underscored the distinctiveness of Eastern Orthodoxy as a religious tradition. Orthodoxy is not a Western church. It has overlap with forms of Western Christianity, but it's distinct. So civil society actors should meet the Orthodox where they are and learn about their ethos, teaching, and history. And going further, they should seek to identify resources within the Eastern Orthodox tradition that can respond to sexual diversity and to adopt language to speak to Orthodox about these sorts of questions. Orthodoxy is a complex tradition. It may be conservative, but it is not monolithically so. So if I was to give you a headline, I would say, don't be Orientalist. There is a lot of self-orientalization that goes on in Orthodoxy itself, in sort of making itself rarefied. But also Orthodoxy has often struggled with the weight of the East. And so if you meet Orthodox as they are, this will further the whole question of which is a civil society question of the rights of LGBTQ persons. Secondly, cooperate with religious actors. Civil society people, policymakers, politicians should seek out Orthodox religious actors who acknowledge a nuanced understanding of their own religious tradition. And this will enable them to better assess and negotiate with institutional orthodoxy. You're not going to be able to get a dialogue with the Orthodox Church in terms of its hierarchs, its clergy, its key lay educators and leaders, unless you meet those who are willing to talk to you and are interested in this issue. And so the Orthodox can help build up the public sphere. And so one should seek out those who are interested in doing that, who are willing to get others in the institution of Orthodox Church to be a part of that process. Now, Orthodoxy is personal, and progress in Orthodoxy, if you want to talk about that, progress in Orthodoxy, it will only come through building personal relationships. Next one, we need to enable deep conversations. Gregory talked about this, the importance. One of the magnificent things of the Oxford meeting was that you had people who were of very different opinions, and they were coming together and talking despite, well, because of their difference, but because their difference, but also their commonality, that they shared Orthodoxy in common and were dedicated to it. So Orthodoxy can build up the secular public sphere if it's able to have these sorts of conversations, which civil society actors can fund through the British Council, for example. They can enable, through projects like this, a respectful dialogue between conservatives and progressives. Orthodoxy, again, is not monolithic. It may be conservative, but there are many shades of that. And so through encounters, such as we saw in our Oxford meeting, this permits these clashing voices to come together and to encounter one in a constructive way. This will help Orthodoxy in what I believe is its next step, which is to build a response to Western modernity and a response to secularism, which is unique to Orthodoxy, what I sometimes call in some of my writings an alternative modernity, an alternative secularity. Next, use our project's resources. Civil society actors can use the things which are created by groups such as ourselves, such as the long report, which Gregory had mentioned, our final report, all the diversity of different essays that have come out of this project, and they will help that to educate themselves and to educate others. Next, promote our project's work and projects like it. So civil society actors often have greater access to promotional resources, either through media or the social media. And so they can leverage these forms of media to highlight the complexity of Eastern Christianity. Often this complexity is not even known by the Orthodox themselves. And so they, in a way, can see a picture of themselves held up to themselves. And this type of nuance and complexity can be encouraged. So you can support, in a way, Orthodoxy simply by promoting this new and interesting kind of work that we're doing. And then next, expanding our project's model. The model that we've developed for intensive dialogue on complex religious questions with a view to civil society can be replicated. And I'll just give you one instance of this. So we had, as was mentioned by Gregory, some ecumenical observers, Catholic and Protestant, Anglican, and some Catholic observers who were very, very supportive of us. And some of them have now gotten together, and there's going to be a meeting in July of 2021. It was supposed to, in fact, be in July of 2020, but the pandemic happened. And it's going to be meeting in the Institut Catholique of Paris, and going to be talking about the Catholic theology and homosexuality. And they're using our model to try to bring together an international thing of different opinions to talk and encounter one another to see how Catholicism fits. So religious voices can upbuild the public sphere precisely as religious voices. And we see that this can have significance not only for Orthodoxy, but also for Catholicism. Now, lastly, the last thing which I would mention is patronizing further research. So public and private research funding should continue to be directed towards enabling gatherings modeled on our Oxford Conference and greater cooperation between civil society groups and research initiatives similar to our project. So when you fund projects similar to us, it has a knock-on effect in the world of Eastern Orthodoxy, which is 200 million or more, and even beyond. And just to give one example, Gregory and I wanted to really think through, if one could think in this way about this one issue to do with sexual diversity, why not other issues which are challenges to Orthodoxy, such as democracy, such as bioethics. And these issues are important. And in that light, we've drafted a new research project, which is entitled Fathoming Orthodox Christian Identity, Questions and Challenges from Late Modernity for a Liturgical Pre-Modern Tradition. And what we think, and one of the things that came out of our research, was that the Orthodox very often, because they think in this sort of liturgical manner, they think through and struggle through contemporary issues as it affects their community as a worshiping community. So to give you one example, to do with people who are LGBTQ, how do you include them in the worship of the community? That would be the question that I think Orthodox would first ask. So this has a knock-on effect. So when you patronize research like this, it actually helps to build up the secular public sphere as something which is includes the Orthodox. So in short, the message of this project to civil society actors, to policymakers, is that engaging Orthodox religious actors makes an essential constructive, and positive difference to thinking through policy outcomes with respect to LGBTQ rights in relationship to orthodoxy and Orthodox majority countries. It is possible to make the secular public sphere one where a conservative religious group like Orthodoxy can be there and build it up. And our project wants to work towards that future. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, Gregory. Thank you, everyone. In a moment, we're going to start answering the questions which have been coming in during the presentations, and I would encourage all of our participants, I can see there are quite a few this afternoon, to continue to send questions through. But before that, I just want to invite Sarah and first Michael to give some reflections on the things that they heard from the presentations. So thank you. Michael.
Thank you, Josh. You know, I guess maybe just, if I may start on a personal note, I did have the enormous privilege of attending the event at Oxford last summer. And I have to say, I've over the years attended perhaps more than my share of seminars and events and conferences. This was, without question, the most profound, I think, of among those events that I've attended. And I think it was for the very reasons that Gregory and Brandon have pointed out. The fact that there was a space within which such contentious issues were able to be discussed in an atmosphere that, yes, the time was quite fraught, but on the whole was immensely welcoming and respectful. And I think this is really what resonates so much with me about this project. You know, just to expand on a point that I made earlier, the region that I work in encompasses Eastern Europe, parts of Eastern Europe, the South Caucasus, and Central Asia. Now, obviously, not all of these areas are majority Orthodox, but many of them are. But regardless of what the religious tradition is, we've seen over the years since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, the resurgence of religion into public and political life. And you know, as I was mentioning, I think a lot of the criticisms that were raised in the presentation about the approach that secular Western donor organizations in general, and again speaking from my own observations and my own opinion on this matter, I think we have allowed ourselves to fall into this space of sort of very binary thinking, right? Of seeing the return of religion into the public sphere as one that is sort of an unambiguous threat, right, to the kind of work and the kinds of values that we represent. I think it's enormously unfortunate. You know, clearly there are challenges that you know we do see, but at the same time, I think it has blinded us to the opportunities for engagement. And I think it really behooves us to think more about this. So what I see, and I see the potential of this project very much in that area. It's an idea that, you know, some of us have thought about and discussed in the past, but finding an opportunity, finding a clear entry point has been a struggle. And I think the fact that this project exists and the fact that it chose such a contentious topic is something that is tremendously inspiring, and I think of undoubted importance to an organization such as ours, or indeed of other similar organizations that have a similar mandate and focus. So I think there's a great deal that we can discuss going forward, but perhaps I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Michael. Sarah.
Thank you, Josh. As someone who works in the United States on religion and politics, thinking about the public sphere, I have been linking this project immensely to what's happening in terms of the protests with Black Lives Matters, and I was specifically watching the reaction to Archbishop Elpidophoros' involvement in Brooklyn at the Black Lives Matter rally. The mobilization of conservative Orthodox actors against his presence there was alarming, and it was not because he was in support of Black lives mattering in the public sphere. It was because Black Lives Matter, they believe, has an LGBTQ+ agenda. So if there can be a fruitful dialogue going forward with these conservative actors about why it is important to be involved politically in the social sphere, that's very important. how we do that is going to be a little bit more complicated. And I think that this project offers us a great way to start engaging these conservative actors through appropriate, thoughtful means. Whether this can translate into smaller settings, we'll see on the ground, specifically in communities where there are Orthodox parishes that could be sites of involvement in these dialogues. So this is an excellent project to go forward, and I'm excited that Brandon is thinking about issues of democracy, which are extremely linked to issues of gender and race and all of the other interwoven connected parts of this project. So thanks, Brandon.
Thank you, Sarah. Now opening up to the Q&A section, and a question that came in from, and excuse me while I find the question, from Lyubov Kostova, apologies if I mispronounced your name, a question about the geographies of countries involved. Gregory, I wonder if you could take that one.
Yeah, I can take that. So it should be said and made clear that the project is not officially a church project. So no churches were officially represented. And that was absolutely necessary to our methodology, because one of the issues for having an open conversation on this topic is that as soon as it becomes an official conversation, people start being told that they're not allowed to come, or that they have to come, or they have to say certain things. So it was unofficial. But I've quickly looked through the list of our participants, and I can say that we had members of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, the Patriarchate of Antioch, the Church of Russia, the Church of Serbia, the Church of Romania, the Church of Georgia, the Church of Greece, the Church of Poland, the Orthodox Church in America, the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, the Antiochian Archdiocese of North America, the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of North America, the Church of Crete, and the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. I may have missed a couple, but that's a pretty good spread of the Orthodox world. Yeah, so essentially, yeah, people from those traditions with knowledge of those churches were present and took part in the conference in an unofficial capacity.
And it should be just mentioned that we, to talk about diversity, that we had representatives of all the main major orders in the Orthodox Church, which is to say bishop, priest, and deacon, but also lay leaders, male and female, in the Orthodox Church, and people with expertise, not just in theology, but in psychiatry, in sociology, so that we had a very, we were drawing from many different disciplines, parts of the church, and you know, kind of global areas of the church.
Thank you. And then there was a question also, Gregory, which I thought you'd be able to pick up on the Byzantine Rite.
Yes. Yeah, there was a question about the participation of Byzantine Catholic churches. We had one participant who has biritual faculties, so celebrates the Byzantine liturgy in the Catholic Church, although he doesn't come from a Byzantine Catholic background historically, but is very familiar with those churches, especially in the diaspora, but also in the homelands. Many of course, the conclusions would apply, and we did discuss the situation in Ukraine specifically, and we had representatives, lay representatives of organizations in Europe who are very familiar with the mixed situation in Ukraine. So a small delegation, but the issues were discussed in a way that I think would apply to both contexts. The main difference, of course, being that for Byzantine Catholics, their canon law has been recodified. So there is a much clearer stance on many issues, whereas for Orthodox, the canonical situation is considerably more complex.
Thank you. Some questions now in relation to the process itself and the papers that maybe that were generated by the retreat, and also another question about Trinity Conference. Telly, I wonder if you can pick those up.
Right, thank you. So in terms of the publication of the papers, some of them have already been published in short forms on public orthodoxy. We had at least a few months devoted to a variety of presentations that were given at the Oxford Conference that reflected many different kinds of positions And they were, they're very short, sort of 1,000 word pieces. Some were a little bit longer in order to accommodate sort of the complexity and nuance that people wanted to express. So, and we are finding too that in situations like this, perhaps, sometimes briefer is better. I mean, in the sense of really kind of laying out, laying out sort of bullet point ideas, because in a way, this is such a unique kind of conversation that we're in many ways at this kind of, to some extent, brainstorming, thinking through kind of stage, right? So public orthodoxy was a good forum for that. Some of the papers will be published in a academic volume to be combined with a volume that also is going to publish some papers from a much lesser known series of seminars that occurred in Oslo that was supported by the Coalition on Freedom of Religion and or Belief. And that's connected to the law school at the University of Oslo. And that's in process, And, I think the combination of those particular papers, so the sort of the Oxford, this particular project together with some of the Oslo kind of seminars, papers will be a very strong kind of book, and to some extent really, really unprecedented within the Orthodox world. I should say, so this particular webinar is focusing on sort of the church engagement, sort of at the policy, at the state level, at the cultural, at the political level. People in the Orthodox world have written on that. They have written on that particular aspect, and people like myself, Brandon, Pandali Kalatzidis in Greece, and some others. So at that level, there has been some work done, and it is important to kind of keep the two issues, this kind of intra sort of discussion on the moral question that is to some extent getting a little bit of steam, but also still an intra kind of conversation, but a little bit more projected outward in the sense of how do we engage with pluralism, quite frankly, with pluralism. Now, in terms of these other conferences were mentioned, the questioner is referring to a set of conferences that occurred on similar themes at, say, Tinkan's seminary and Holy Trinity Seminary here in the United States, right? Two different seminaries, but in two different conferences. Whether there would be a willingness to engage in dialogue, and there was. I mean, there was a willingness to engage in dialogue. There were people that were invited and simply refused the invitation. We don't really know why, but I guess I can assume that it had something to do with just simply not wanting to engage in any kind of conversation at all on this issue in any way, without even seeing sort of the complexity of both the political and the moral dimensions, let's say. So I think that in many ways, if this webinar is about the future, then that ultimately is the future, to kind of move forward and have those particular kinds of conversations and dialogues, and hopefully some of the people within the Oxford conference that reflected views that might be similar to those reflected more broadly at those particular conferences might be able to mediate and facilitate that kind of conversation.
Thank you. We have two questions now on similar themes. One from Alan Smart and one from a participant whose name I can't see, but there are questions relating to the history of the church and the history of the church as a persecuted church in many geographies and times, and whether this has given rise to a kind of a liberation theology type equivalent that can be mobilized if such an analogy exists within Orthodox theology. And then also in a kind of parallel question, is there a way that we can avoid seeing these attempts, the kinds of work that the investigators you have been involved with, as some kind of colonial theology, especially given Eastern Orthodox churches in countries like Egypt and Syria, where there's already a feeling from the questioner that these kinds of human rights questions are a Western agenda, quote unquote. So I wonder if you want to try and pick apart those issues.
I can respond first, if I may, to that. In terms of liberation theology. There have been people who have attempted to dialogue with that. Specifically, actually, one of the people who was involved, which Telly Papanikolaou mentioned, Pantelis Keletzidis, he's actively used many resources from that to try to respond. In terms of post-colonial thought, again, one of our, in fact, a person who was an active, one of the sort of people who was involved with on the actual organizing thing to do with the project, George Demakopoulos, has written a lot on post-colonial things. So that's very much involved in the mix of a lot of the thinking. Now, there is a danger, I think, and this is why I had mentioned very briefly in the road ahead, this idea of an alternative modernity and an alternative secularism. There is a danger of simply thinking that one needs to just take up ideas in a Western context and then force them onto the very different civilizations and cultures that are informed and come out of Orthodoxy. And this would be, I think, the wrong approach. And that was certainly not our approach. Our approach was to encourage a deep and searching conversation with knowledge, with deep knowledge of the history and the traditions and the practices of Orthodoxy, and particularly to avoid some sort of taking of Western ideas and then just shoving them onto an Orthodox context. But this is a process which is going to take time. Trying to see how modernity fits in an Orthodox context, how secularism can be adapted in an Orthodox context. It won't be the same. And many thinkers, people like Jose Casanova, Shmuel Eisenstadt, have talked about multiple modernities and multiple secularities. So one of the things that I think that we've been going away to avoid a type of colonial approach is to try to envision and work towards trying to see these challenges, how they fit with Orthodoxy, to tailor a type of response which is sensitive to the Orthodox Church's own position, well, in multiple positions now, but the position more broadly, if you can talk about a broad position. So that would be my attempt, but others may have a response.
I could add just one point on each of those questions. As Brandon said, the attempt to develop something really akin to liberation theology is relatively limited, although there are examples. I think what you see a lot more of in the Orthodox context is an attempt to plumb the tradition for resources in other ways. So an attempt to find parallel circumstances or to rely on a tradition of asceticism, perseverance, perseverance in the face of martyrdom or persecution, which is inspiring to a lot of people on both sides of the argument, it must be said. On the topic of post-colonial issues and whether this could be construed as a colonial topic, when we proposed the project in the beginning, we included the so-called Oriental Orthodox churches in our project. And in the end, we let them go precisely because we were conscious that we did not have the personal resources to handle their situation responsibly. Whereas what we're actually arguing for in the public sphere is a responsible handling of the context and the situations in which these questions are being posed. And so for the Eastern Orthodox people who were represented by our project, yes, although there were people from Western Europe, from North America, from various kind of non-traditional Orthodox contexts, more than half the participants actually come from Eastern Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, so the traditional Orthodox territories. And we were actually very consciously trying to draw out their voices and their opinions, their modes of thinking, so that this doesn't become a colonial project and so that it really emerges from within the tradition.
Thank you. Telly, do you want to add anything?
No, that's...
Thank you. I'm conscious of time and the questions are coming in. We've probably got time for one last question, which is coming again from someone whose name I can't see, I'm afraid, but it's a question about the challenges of these kinds of dialogues and these kinds of engagements. It's written, I think, from someone from outside the Orthodox tradition, asking, well, were there particular challenges with this project, working with, quote unquote, a secular partner? Did that make it harder, less hard? And if so, what were some of the, what might some of the advice you give to a partner seeking to work with Orthodox actors and Orthodox organizations be to ensure the building of trust and a successful outcome?
Will, I'll just mention, and then Telly and Gregory may have something, but I would say just don't stereotype the Orthodox. We have a great diversity. I mean, you can't, but if you are roughly 200 million people, you're going to have something which the complete spread. And we, as Gregory mentioned so well, I mean, there were certainly Poles, but there was everything in between. In fact, I would say that even in certain people, and I would include myself, I have everything in between. And so people should not be stereotyped, and you should just listen to them in a deep way and try to see where they're coming from. And you will often find that very often there's similar type questions. In some cases, there's different questions. I think the difference is the interesting thing, and that maybe is the path ahead to do with a kind of a liturgical consciousness, lived religion, which is something which I know that Sarah is a specialist in. That's something which in a way is unique to the Orthodox context, that we think things through in terms of worship. But I'd say the biggest challenge in trying to get non-Orthodox is just for them to accept us, not based on their Orientalist expectations. So yes, but Gregory and others, you may have something else to add to that.
Yeah, I would just say, I'm not a policy expert, but I imagine policy happens in a variety of kinds of ways. I mean, it probably differs between a totalitarian regime versus a democratic regime. Most of the Orthodox countries, although that's shifting quickly given the recent elections in Serbia, most of the Orthodox countries are supposedly within regimes that are at least claiming to be democratic. I do recognize the fact that that is questionable, but I would, I think that at the policy level, I mean, policy is meant to sort of implement, kind of see a way forward to implement certain kinds of goals. And I guess at the policy level, either religion is an ally or an enemy. The institution is either an ally or an enemy. And I just think that kind of way of, at least within a democratic system where policy often encourages input, discussion, dialogue, consideration of views. I would just, and I guess within what one might call kind of liberal secular states, even though those terms are themselves contested in so many ways. But going with terminology in liberal secular states, I guess, the main thing I would hope for and advise is to not necessarily see the Orthodox Church monolithically as this kind of enemy in terms of certain kinds of policy goals, which might be based on what might be called liberal principles, especially human rights. There are all kinds of policy initiatives, perhaps, that could be taken, as was really mentioned throughout here. There could be all kinds of policy initiatives that I can imagine that could be that could facilitate, in many ways, the kinds of conversation we had at Oxford, in a much broader sense, right? And if anything, to promote a certain kind of civility around these particular kinds of questions, rather than a certain kind of diametrical opposition, which often policy does.
Thank you. I'd just be keen to draw in Sarah or Michael at this point, just to sort of reflect on that question of challenges and opportunities that are particular, I suppose, to working with Orthodox partners. Wonder if you could speak to that question.
I absolutely can. I think one of the problems is that we all, in our own ways, whether we're Orthodox or not, live in echo chambers, right? We're all sort of in these bubbles where everyone seemingly agrees with us in our social spheres. And if we want to understand communities that have differing views, we have to step outside of those echo chambers and live in that experience with them for a while, right? And so a question I often ask my very conservative interlocutors that I work with is, do you know a queer person, right? Tell me about the experiences you've had with them. And that is a really transformative question because it allows them to think about and reflect on their own embodied experiences with people. And that's really how change and dialogue starts.
Thank you. Michael.
Yeah, I just want to say I couldn't agree more with that last point. I mean, we I can think of myself in the kinds of interactions that I have in my professional capacity. There's a certain, I would suppose, community that I'm used to speaking to, and that there's a certain way of a certain perspective that I've some sort of come to accept as kind of as the default. And I think this is something that, as I've said before, I think has done us in many ways a great disservice, and it feeds stereotypes on both sides, right? The stereotypes go both ways. So there's the stereotypes that secular, liberal, again recognizing the problematic nature of those labels might have towards those of a more traditional or religious orientation, and vice versa, right? The idea that of Western donors, that we somehow are on a mission to destroy traditional values or what have you. These kinds of stereotypes work both ways, and I think they are very much a function of the kinds of echo chambers that Sarah was mentioning. So I think stepping outside of this space and acknowledging very, very much of the lived experience of the personhood is a really important first step in overcoming these kinds of stereotypes, which I think only just further feed the polarization and tension that we've seen. So yeah, I absolutely could not agree more with points that have been made.
Thank you, Michael. I'd just be keen to turn the question back to our investigators just before we wrap up. I mean, can you imagine the success that you achieved in Oxford having taken place had the convener not been you? If the convener had been the British Council by itself, is there a need for this kind of dialogue for it to be seen to be quote unquote safe or authentic or inclusive, for it to be framed by experts within Orthodoxy?
Yeah, I can jump in. I would say absolutely. I think, I mean, it's both and. The neutral space of the kind of secular academy that was afforded to this project by the British Council, it was absolutely essential to it. I mean, as I pointed out in my presentation, ecclesiastical contexts for these kinds of conversations are very few. And basically they go on, diverse conversations on these topics now go on in secular contexts. In secular contexts, I include, for example, Fordham University's Center for Orthodox Christian Studies, which is a Catholic university, but effectively a large research university. So that secular context is absolutely necessary. But I do think that you've hit the nail on the head, that without this conversation emerging from, being constructed by, being convened by people within the tradition, it really seems like you're kind of being goaded and kind of drawn onto other people's territory. And it is also worth saying that the Orthodox world, even though it includes 200 million people, the ecclesiastical world is surprisingly small. And much of what was possible because of personal networks. And that inevitably, of course, means that we missed people that should have been part of the conversation, but it also, those relationships of trust, many of which have existed for many years, decades, those were absolutely essential, because one of the things that's often striking about this particular issue, but other issues, is that people don't know what one another think. They're a little bit afraid to say it. And so they need to be given space. They need to trust one another. And so, yeah, I think absolutely both and.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just echo Gregory. what was unique about this, and where we are very grateful to the British Council and to our universities, University of Exeter and Fordham, and indeed to the Galileo Foundation, which also helped us, is that it allowed what I would call interlocking circles. And because this existed in between all these different kind of circles and they're interlocking, that it was successful. If it had been external, as it were, coming from the outside, people who don't have the sort of interlocking circles, which the project leaders, well, here, Telly, Gregory, and I have, it would be a very different thing, because it's to do with the fact that Orthodoxy is unique. It's the product of a different civilization, a different narrative, a different world, but it also is very much in the West, in terms of the West being the reality in China, the West being the reality in Africa, what Heidegger called the age of the world picture. So the interlocking circles happened, and we're very grateful to the British Council for allowing this encounter to happen.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that image of interlocking circles and this question of trust just is something that comes across so strongly from this project, and is one that I'm going to remember when I read over your report again, which I would encourage all of our participants this afternoon to do so. You'll shortly, with that, I have to draw this quick Q&A session to a close. We're coming to the end of the seminar, but I just want to remind you that you will be receiving shortly an email in your inbox with the final report as produced by Brandon and colleagues. And in that email, you'll also find a link to a short survey that will be used by the British Council to evaluate the quality of the project. This is anonymous, and the data will be used only to independently assess the program itself, and everyone involved would be extremely grateful if you took a few minutes to complete it. If you've enjoyed this seminar, then you might be interested to know that there is another Bridging Voices webinar coming up in a few weeks' time, which will be on the subject of the Muslim Atlantic, and will be at the same time on August 11th. And so finally, it leaves me, I'm left to thank all our speakers, to thank Brandon, Gregory, Telly, to thank also Sarah and Michael for your contributions, to thank you, to thank the British Council US and also the Henry Luce Foundation for supporting this important research. And finally, thank you all for your attention, for your questions. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I get the sense that some interesting new lines of conversations have emerged. Thank you, and take care.